everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about makerspaces. So my name is Holly Graffam and I work for the Department of Education as an MLTI ambassador. And I've included here my contact information. Um, there will be in the description below this video, there will be a PDF of this presentation. And so you'll have access to these links and any other links that I use throughout the presentation. So why do you need a makerspace? If you're using the engineering design process or the design thinking process or the science inquiry approach, students need the opportunity to create and design their solutions. So throughout this series, I've been talking about these different processes, engineering design or design thinking, the science inquiry approach, which are all really a iteration of a student-centered problem-solving process. And you'll notice that part of that process is building solutions. And so students need to have space, time, and materials in order to participate in that part of the process. And as I have mentioned before, when we're talking about makerspace, it may be the traditional sense of makers and they're building something like in the engineering design process, but don't leave out in the makerspace that there can also be digital opportunities for students to create. It's really all about students creating solutions to their designs. So another benefit of makerspaces is that it fosters the move from consumer to creator. So students consume lots of digital content, and this is an opportunity for them to actually become creators of content. So here are some considerations when you are designing your makerspace. So the first big consideration is location. So are you going to have a large space like a lab or a classroom? Is it going to be a shelf or a corner in a room or a library? Or it could even be a mobile cart space. And also it could be a combination of these things. The next consideration is where will students work? Is this going to happen in a classroom? Students are going to be working at their desks, or will there be certain tables available for them to work in? If they're creating, students need space to actually do that. What equipment needs designated space? So if you're going to use a 3D printer, that has to have a designated place. You don't want to be bringing it out, setting it up, calibrating it every time. So be thinking about those things. If you are fortunate enough to have some of the power tools or woodworking equipment, what kind of space do you need for that as well? And then along with that, when we're starting to look at these larger equipment pieces, what safety concerns do you need to have? Do you need to have safety goggles, a fire extinguisher, all of those kinds of things? And that could even really be right down to, do I need to have, a small first aid kit of Band-Aids and whatever in my makerspace area? And this is a huge piece, is storage. I would say that this is second to the location, because this is going to be those two pieces, the location and the storage capacity, are really going to drive what equipment and materials you're going to be able to include in your makerspace. So where will you store equipment, materials, and supplies? Will you have cabinets? Will you have a closet um, in your building somewhere that these are going to be stored? Is it a section of the library? You need to know where you're going to be able to store all the pieces that you have in your makerspace. And this is even if you are designing a makerspace could be for the whole building, and it really could just be for you in your classroom as a classroom teacher. But you'll still need to have the same considerations are applicable regardless of what the situation is. Um, how will equipment, materials, and supplies be organized? Uh, you may not need every single thing for every single project. So, or if students are going to, if you've got older students and they're going to be the ones that will be self selecting, how are you going to organize these materials so that, kids aren't spending hours trying to go through bins to find the things that they need? How will students access the supply? So I just kind of referenced that. Will students um, often what have done in the past is I've had things stored in a closet space, and then I had a mobile cart as well. And I would load up the mobile cart with the things that I thought were going to be the most applicable to whatever design thinking project they were doing. If a student came to me and said, boy, I really would like to have this or that or the other thing, then I could go pull those things out. But I had a pretty good supply that students could just access on their own. I'd bring the cart to wherever we were, and students could come up and get the things that they needed along the way. And then another thing is, how will you store projects in process? So most likely the makerspace stuff that you do is not going to happen in a class period. It could, but it's probably not. I think as teachers, we've all kind of been in the middle of that situation. Where are we going to store all these posters and whatever? And now imagine that you have, like, if you're in a middle school or a high school, you might have 50, 60 kids who are all of a sudden creating things, and you need a place to store those. So be thinking about that as well. The next behind, now you've found a space, you've kind of started thinking about these other considerations, storage and whatever. Now comes the hard part, the budget. This part is also probably the third driver behind what materials and equipment you're going to be able to have. Um, it it's probably goes without saying that the initial startup budget is going to be way larger than any kind of annual budget, but know that you will need a startup and an annual budget, because there will be consumables that you include in your makerspace that you're going to have to you're going to need some ongoing funding to be able to um, replenish those supplies as they are depleted. Uh, I and you will also need, even for the non-consumables, part of your ongoing budget will be like replacements, or you want to also be thinking about the future. So maybe this year I didn't, I bought all I could with what I had with my budget, but I really need a 3D printer. And so that's going to be part of next year's budget. So you will have some non-consumables. I think that they make up a large portion of your startup budget, or should make a large portion of your startup budget, but know that you might also be thinking about including those in your ongoing budgets that you have. And then, there is free and donated materials. Who wants to turn that away? The only thing with free and donated materials is you need to keep in mind your storage capacity. It's great that people want to give you buckets and buckets of Legos, but if you don't have any place to store them, then your room just becomes buckets and buckets of stuff that people have given you. So I also want to start talking about technology, because I think people think of maker spaces and they think of, oh, kids are going to be doing, arts and crafts activities. and that might be and should be part of your makerspace, but technology should also be central to your makerspace. And these, and I'm going to talk about technology in the non-consumables. And there's really four categories that I like to break tech into. There's high tech, which that's like a 3D printer, a laser cutter. You might have microcomputers like microbits and Arduinos and the various components that go with that. This could be your robotics. This might be where you have software or subscriptions to different online resources. These are things where typically students will need some instruction, um, more than just peripheral instruction on how to use this technology. So beyond how is it's going to connect to whatever design thinking or engineering design project that you want to do, they also are probably going to need some instruction in this high tech. Then we have low tech. And yes, students will probably need some instruction, but usually it's, at a very much more accessible level. Cameras. It usually only takes like what, 1 or 2 minutes, and most kids already know how to use a camera. You want to make sure that you have still and video cameras, or a camera that can be a still or video camera. All in one is great. Printers, I'm talking about like your traditional printers where kids send stuff to the printer, keyboards, monitors. When I say monitors, because sometimes, especially when kids are programming, having kind of something larger than just their laptop, um, computer screen space, a large monitor can be great for those things. It might be a green screen as kids are creating their own videos, USB drives and cords. And I did put in makey and squishy circuits in here because those are pretty low tech. These things require very minimal additional instruction by you. And it really even could just be an on-demand video on how to use any of these things, and kids should be able to access the low-tech pieces. And then there is industrial tech. So these would be power tools, woodworking tools, maybe soldering, a staple gun. These again will probably need additional, more instruction towards similar to your high tech. Kids will want to have some instruction in these areas. And these might also be something that you only consider for older students, but not necessarily. And then you've got really your no tech, or virtually no tech, glue guns, a basic toolkit with hammer and screws and, screwdrivers and wrenches and that kind of thing, scissors and rulers, pliers and wire cutters, paintbrushes. All of these things are low tech items that you're going to want to include in your makerspace. And again, these are your non-consumables, right? These are things that you may have to replace some things here and there, but for the most part, you're going to be able to have these in your maker spaces for longer periods of time. And when I say technology, this is assuming that students have access to devices in the internet. If you are not in a one-to-one environment, then you may need to consider having a laptop or an iPad cart of devices that students can use when they go into the makerspace. It doesn't necessarily have to be one-to-one in the classroom, because at any given time, students may or may not be using that level of technology. So, but if you're not in a one-to-one, or where students don't readily have access to devices in the internet, then that is another non-consumable consideration you're going to want for your makerspace. So the consumables, and I won't go through this list, and it's really not an exhaustive list. But when you're thinking about consumables, the two things that you're really going to be thinking about are what are the things that I'm going to have to purchase? You may or may not get them donated, or you may not be found. And when I say found, that's famously teachers, clearing out their classrooms or cleaning their garages at home, and they can bring in things that they are looking to reuse or recycle. But these are things that may not, you might have things, particularly like duct tape and electrical tape. You aren't going to get huge donations of those. You might get some, but so those are things that you want to be thinking about in your budget list, because you do have to have some consumable um, pieces. And then you have the found and the donated stuff. So this is all of your crafting things. I'd like to point out, beyond the traditional crafting pieces that we are looking at, old toys and old Legos are make great donated items, because students can take them apart and use pieces of them in their design creations. They could use them if they are going to make some stop animation type videos, or dioramas or whatever. So don't discount, like, I'm not talking like big toys. I'm talking, like little toys, like think your McDonald's Happy Wheels stuff, that kind of thing. So don't discard those ideas if people have them, because you'd be surprised at what students can use. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. I have in my resource section, there will be kind of some lists for you to use as guidelines as you are looking to create a makerspace. If you build it, will they come? Often, what I have seen in my own experiences and have spoken to colleagues about is that we have these maker spaces and they're not utilized to their potential. And there are some barriers as to why um, you cannot seem to get your colleagues on board with including makerspace activities or lessons or design thinking in get them to come in and use the makerspace. Because if you're going to um, find funding, which might mean grants or educational foundation stuff, or asking for it to be in your budget. If you're going to have that kind of investment in there, you really want to use it to its greatest potential, right? So here are some barriers that we need to think about removing. One might be having a mobile option that can be brought to the classroom. Maybe it's just the teachers, like, getting the kids all together and going down to the space and getting that started, and then having to clean up and go back to the classroom. Like, I don't want to lose that time. That might be a barrier. If you have a mobile option, like I mentioned before, I often had stuff stored in a larger space, but I would have a mobile cart. So if you have a mobile cart, um, you or the teacher, whoever, could just pull the things out that they think that they're going to need for that day or that activity, and bring that back to their classroom and kind of have that in their classroom. Um, Often people just don't even know, like, well, what am I, beyond bringing a bunch of kids in to make posters or do arts and crafts, what is it that I can do with this maker space that is going to be connected to curriculum? So if you create a showcase activity, I'm calling it, that to demonstrate the benefits of incorporating the maker space, then that will hopefully get other teachers thinking about how they too might be able to incorporate Makerspace in their curriculum. And along with that is inviting colleagues to observe the Makerspace in action. So if you have a class that's in there doing some of this great Makerspace work, and you have a colleague that's on the fence, or maybe somebody who's a little resistant, um, yeah, bring them in and show them how engaging it is, how it can be connected to curriculum. Um, and I think that you'll really find that that's a effective way to convert some people into makerspace champions. And then supporting PD for the technology components. So lots of times teachers are reluctant to have kids make videos or create digital uh, products because they themselves don't know that they have the capacity of to teach students the technology, or if you want them to use Scratch, let's say, or some other coding pieces. So supporting PD for technology components, whether that is supporting PD for the teachers or providing tutorial or learning opportunities for the technology with students, that is another way that will help break down some of these barriers of teachers not utilizing maker spaces to their potential. And always, I think, again, we're looking beyond just crafting here. Maker spaces are a highly engaging opportunity to for students to create, to demonstrate their learning, and it can be connected to your curriculum. So here are just some, these are just some examples. There is multiple examples that you can use. But for instance, in science class, maybe they're learning about thermal energy. I know that that is a next generation science standard. So maybe they create solar ovens. And when we're talking about creating something like a solar oven challenge, I'm not saying here's a step-by-step process on how to create a solar oven. What you want to do is say, here's a bunch of stuff, create the best solar oven that you can, and allow students to explore different materials. And then at the end, have them reflect on the effectiveness of their solar oven. Like, did the materials that they select, did that work? Did they have to iterate their design? And then for, they have to use their knowledge of thermal energy to really defend and analyze and reflect on their effectiveness of their solar oven. Um, I've talked a little bit about this technology generated demonstrations of learning. They could make stop motion animated videos with Legos, toys, clay, or they could use an online stop animation software program to demonstrate their learning. They could create images and visuals for students to put in their own um, videos and websites and presentations. Rather than just getting some clip art or an image off the internet, they could create their own and include those images in the technology generated demonstrations of learning. I've done a whole presentation on novel engineering. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can go back and look at that presentation. But this uses the engineering design process with around problem solving and characters and settings in novels. So that's certainly, if when you get to that designing and creating a solution, would a makerspace would be a perfect place for students to be able to do that in. There's several, I've put two math connections here. As students are going through the iterative process in the design thinking or engineering design or problem solving or student or inquiry based science uh, process, they're going to be collecting data and they're going to be iterating that. And right there, that data collection is definitely got some math connections. They could create visual representations beyond. I mean, obviously, they could use, create charts and graphs like in Google Sheets, but what if they like made something tangible that was a visual representation of the data that they collected. And when you are building prototypes, um, typically, sometimes the prototypes are, real to scale, they're real life size, but often when we think of prototypes, we think of them in some kind of scale. So right there, there's some built-in math that you could really be using to make sure, if I was a math teacher and I was teaching scale, maybe we're going to build, I just put in here a catapult. But what make sure it's real to scale, right? And so there's some other math things. A colleague, fellow ambassador, Kate uh, Meyer, turned me on to a writer's makerspace. And so this is specifically um, around writing and our students, creating short stories, have them craft characters or build an antagonist. If they're working on dialogue, they could make puppets and do the conversation with partners as a way to learn the dialogue writing process. So there's a real specific makerspace around the writer's makerspace, which I found really interesting. So as you can see, that like the novel engineering, I have done that in social studies and ELA, um, math, science, writing. All of those have connections that you can use your makerspace. So when somebody says, "Oh, well, don't they do that in art class?" and it'll be like, well, they might do some art in art class, but can't they take those skills and bring it into your classroom? A makerspace is not just an, a crafting space. It's not just a art space. It is a way for students to create products to demonstrate their learning. I got just a few recommendations for getting started with your makerspace. Start small. Um, start again. Just start small. Even just a mobile cart if that's where you want to start. A lot of starting small will be around your budget. You're gonna that's most of us will have a constraint on funding, and so making the best use of your budget money, uh, and don't go out and buy everything at once. Really, and then I did learn this a little bit the hard way. There were a few things um, that I purchased that were of a higher cost that just didn't turn out to be um, as advantageous to the maker spaces I had hoped they would be. So really be thoughtful, and maybe if you've got a small budget, maybe it's only investing in one or two of the high tech, which tend to be your high cost items. Um, Design one high interest based problem based learning opportunity to build teacher and student capacity. Don't feel like you have to use a makerspace for everything that you do. Um, but certainly, if you can have one really great makerspace learning experience, then and that from there you'll be able to reflect and take what you've learned and build that capacity for yourself and for your students. Um, Along the way, I talked a little bit about some of the need around um, the some of the high tech components that you might include in your makerspace, and students are going to need to have some instruction in those. So make sure you develop low stake activities that allow students to learn and practice with new technologies. I've said this multiple times across many of these presentations that I have done. We do a real disservice to ourselves and to our students and to their learning when we ask them to learn new content and new technology at the same time. They should either be learning new technology and accessing prior knowledge that they already have. That would be like a low stakes activity, or they should be learning new content with prior knowledge of technology that they already have. So, for instance, if I thought that I wanted students to build a 3D product as part of their engineering design, and I wanted everybody to do 3D printing, I would want to have students practice with the CAD program and the 3D printer on something before they did this big project that is going to demonstrate their learning, right? They need to have that background knowledge that they can access. And that's just kind of a off the top example. Um, Along with that, although I would say that I would say never, but I would be reluctant to say everybody was going to use the 3D printer unless it was in a tech. That to me is more of a technology class where you are building the capacity around 3D printing. And so, yes, you want everybody to use it. It goes to my last thing: offer choice to increase student engagement. If a student is totally into the high tech stuff, let them, or that's a way to entice them into this learning experience, then have them use that. If that offer different choices to students to access whatever materials or creativity that is um, of high interest to them, and you're going to build, you will increase student agency right there. So I'm a real fan of choice. And even if you are and I'm talking a lot about connecting this to curriculum, but there's nothing to say that you can't just be like, you know what? Today we're going to have Makerspace hour, and today is an opportunity if you want to learn a new piece of technology or you want to create something, or um, I think it's okay to do that once in a while. Um, that's another great time to offer choice, right? It could be, okay, we're all gonna learn, we're gonna get the makerspace out, and I want everybody to come away with some new skill, and offer a plethora of choices that students can select from. Again, anytime you can include student choice and voice, I feel like it increases student engagement and agency. I've curated a list of resources here. Um, some of them are people or websites that I think you should follow. So there's some books in here, and some of them are some just articles. I can't say enough about John Spencer, who co-author of Launch: Using Design Thinking to Boost Creativity and Bring Out the Maker in Every Student. He's one of the people that really kind of, I wouldn't say started the maker movement, but reinvigorated it. Um, and he has a master class that he offers that you can pay for. It's all about Makerspace, but he does offer a free 35-minute webinar. It's called Create a Makerspace in a Week. And he kind of really talks a lot more eloquently and at more of an expert level on some of the things that we've just talked about in this little short um, presentation, but he really goes through the step-by-step pieces that you in more depth and detail about creating a makerspace. So that was I took the 35-minute webinar and felt it very I felt it very valuable. So that's one thing. AJ Giuliani, I also subscribe um, to his blog and receive those. Uh, I think he puts them out once a month or maybe a couple times a month. He also co-authored with John the launch book. So I put a link to his website. Check out his blog ideas. His go some they're often about um, you know uh, creating opportunities for student engagement and promoting student agency. So sometimes it's beyond just the makerspace stuff, but I would definitely check him out. And then Sylvia Libbo Martinez, she is the co-author of Invent to Learn, and they've just published a new expanded second edition that's updated some of the technology pieces. And I've linked in here an interview of her where she's talking about her philosophy on making and tinkering and why that's important in the classroom and for our students today. So uh, if you want to take some time and watch that video, that would be great. The Cult of Pedagogy website has some great books on makerspaces. I've linked that in. Um, Spark Creativity, which is where I got some resources on the writer makerspace, which is kind of a more specific kind of makerspace on how to start one and 5 ways to use them. The Makerspace playbook is a PDF that's like the nuts and bolts of creating a makerspace. It has lots of lists and really just probably everything you might need to know about makerspace. The Institute for Art Integration in STEAM, that is also another manual of how to create your makerspaces. They have lots of lists on supplies that you should include. And remember, when you're looking at these lists of supplies, think about what's going to work for you, what your budgets are, how much tech is going to be included in yours. Uh, you use these as guidelines, not as Bibles of what you have to do. And then I've also included um, a couple of articles, Creating a Makerspace That Works, um, Ultimate Makerspace Guide for Schools and Libraries. So very often we find these makerspaces in the corners of our libraries or learning commons. And so this is really geared towards that. Making claymation in the classroom. I think that this is a probably one of the easiest ways to connect technology and making, because kids are going to be physically creating stuff with clay or Legos and setting up scenes with small cars or whatever, creating backdrops, all of that stuff to make but they're using technology to make the movie. And then finally, I included this brown bag challenge, and this is by, I think it's called Starfish Education, and these you do have to pay for these, but I brought them in because they are the concept around them is you give students a small brown bag of stuff that's curated based on whatever it is that you want them to do. And be like, for instance, the catapult. I've done these with students, and that was the frog leap, right? And so here was this brown bag of stuff, and you had to design something, i.e., a catapult, to get your frog to leap off the ground onto a target that might be feet away. And I elevated mine. So, like, kids were on the floor with their frog and had to get the frog up onto a table that actually had, like, you you cut out like a little lily pad that they tape down to the table, and that's kind of a target. There's a lot for that. There was lots of making and designing and iteration of the catapults, like what was going to work. Um, and then they had to think about um, angles and all of that, because where they were going to place their catapult, like what was the launch angle that they were going to be thinking about. So there was a lot of math involved in that particular one, but that's just one of the brown bag challenges. They have a solar oven. I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. Brown bag challenge. So the idea is that you're curating a list. So this is another way, like we talked about bringing in a cart of stuff. This is another way of saying, okay, I only want to have this small amount of stuff in my makerspace for this particular activity. So those brown bag challenges are great. So I put them in there, even though it is something that you would have to pay for. They're not super cost prohibitive. And I think she has some bundles that you can get, like 10 or 15 of them together. So, anyway, that's another resource. So thank you all for taking out some time and listening to me and learning about Makerspace. I hope this inspires you to think about how you can bring Makerspace to your own school or classroom. If Again, this slide deck will be a PDF in the description area of the video. And on this last slide, you can click um, on where it says click here to receive zero point 0.5 contact hours. Is a brief little form that you have to fill out, and you'll get a link to some contact hours. Thank you again and I hope that you have enjoyed the active learning series, and feel free to go back and look at some of the other presentations that I have, um, and how you might connect maker spaces to those. Thank you and have a great day.